Hello folks, back in the garage on this rainy afternoon and going to be doing part 2 of the Amico TIG 225 review. Now I do have quite a bit of use on the welder now, both in stick mode and TIG mode, and while the power output performance of the welder was honestly better than I expected, there's a few quirks and issues with the welder itself, and there's a lot of issues with the accessories. And we'll go over that here and talk about how it did. Now first of all, I started out in stick mode. I did run multiple types of rod in both 3/32 and 1/8 inch diameters. Now full disclosure, I really don't have a whole lot of stick welding experience, and it's probably been 6 months since I last stick welded up until this review, so keep in mind I'm a little rusty, don't judge me too much. Most of the electrodes I tried ran fine. I did not try any 6010 electrodes, but 6011 did not run all that great. It just didn't have a very forgiving arc for 6011. It was very picky about arc length, travel speed, and amperage settings. And you know, if you got even a tiny bit outside of its preferred zone, the arc would just go out, and it just really didn't run very well at all. I did run 2 different brands of 6011. I ran Hobart and some Lincoln rods just to see if it was a brand specific thing. And then again, just because I don't have a ton of experience with stick in general, I went ahead and fired up my other inverter welder that I use for stick welding just to see if there was any difference, and I didn't have any trouble with the 6011s with that one. So just keep in mind for 6011 electrodes, this welder doesn't do that great. But I also ran 7018, 7014, and 6013 rods, and all of those ran fine. In fact, I do have a little bit of footage of a 1/8 7018 rod, and 7018 rod ran just fine on this welder. I didn't have any issues with it at all. So in general, as a stick welder, it works okay. It did seem like it was a tiny bit more difficult to strike an arc with this welder than with my other one, but not a huge deal. I mean, I didn't have a lot of trouble. So, and I did test 240 and 120 input running stick rods, and I didn't try and push it real hard to push it to the limit, plugged into 120 volts, but I did set the welder really good and hot for 3/32 7018 rod. Honestly, hotter than I would normally ever want to run that rod. It was right on the edge for what would run well. And I was able to burn an entire rod start to finish without stopping, without tripping a breaker or any kind of issues like that. So I think as long as you stick to 3/32 rods, you shouldn't have any issues on 120. Now the biggest electrodes I have are 1/8 inch, so I didn't really push this to the absolute limit with stick mode, but I did burn quite a few 7018 rods without a whole lot of time stopping in between, really just chipping off the slag, kind of getting set up, getting a new rod, and burn another one. So I did put a fair bit of use on it in stick mode, and honestly overall it worked pretty well. And while we're talking about stick mode, we'll go ahead and talk about the issues with the electrode holder and the stinger here. First of all, there is just the feel of cheapness that I talked about in the first part, and the little bit of play in the jaw here, but that actually got quite a bit worse as I was welding, and you can see, and you might be able to see the roll pin is actually backing out. And not that it is broken or anything. I mean, I could push that roll pin back in and maybe stake it or something, but even with that roll pin in there, there's a lot of play here, and I think that play is what's allowing that to work its way out. If that had come completely out at any point while I was welding, this would have went flying and it would have come apart completely. So just kind of an issue there. And then also just due to the play, even with that roll pin in place, when you would stick an electrode in here, this, you know, as you clamp this down, it would sometimes shift a little bit, and it would cause the electrode to kind of pop up out of that notch, and then the electrode could wobble, and you'd go to get started, and it would shift or move, and it's just really a shame that this is that cheap. And just as a comparison, this is the electrode holder I have for my other welder. And the spring is a lot stiffer. There's no play at all in the jaws. And it just has a better overall feel to it. It's just a lot nicer to use. And also, kind of like with the Tig Torch, the included stinger is just a bit bulky for what it is. The included one is just quite a bit bigger. It's longer, it's larger diameter. The handle on it is quite a bit longer and larger. Not that that's a huge deal. I mean, these are replaceable. But it's just a shame that it doesn't come with something better. I mean, again, it's sort of expected. I mean, for the price of the welder, you know there's going to be some concessions. But if it's something you just end up having to replace pretty quick anyways because it's just a pain to use, it didn't really save you much. Now, before we get into all the details of the TIG mode and the good and bad there, this display screen is not accurate. And I checked it with my ammeter and just found that this was off pretty far. It's not off as far in stick mode as it is in TIG mode, but the amount that it's off isn't as consistent in stick mode. It's not a huge issue, but if you've done welding and you kind of have an idea of what amperage you need to dial in to get the heat you need for a specific stick electrode or for a specific joint with TIG, it's probably going to be off on this welder. Or if you're just new starting out and someone says, hey, you know, for a 3/32 70/18, start at 85 amps. Well, if you set this to 85 amps, you're going to be getting quite a lot more than that. Now I'll show a clip here of the difference in the reading between the screen and my meter. I had the meter set up so you could see both while I was welding at different amperages, and you could see the difference. Now I tested it in both TIG and stick modes, but I only got video of it in TIG mode while I started an arc at some different amp settings, just to kind of show the difference between what the display was showing and what the meter was actually reading, so what the welder was actually putting out. And again, I didn't film it in stick mode, but just know that the difference in stick mode was a little bit less than that, whereas in the TIG mode it was anywhere from about 18 to 22. In stick mode it was more like 8 to 12 amps different. So again, if you were to dial in 85 amps for that 3/32 70/18, you'd actually be getting more like 97 from the welder. So just something to keep in mind. Now in TIG mode, I was able to get the full rated output out of the machine, actually a couple amps more. You probably saw at the end of that clip I was able to get 222 amps out of the machine. Now while I was able to get the full output out of it, it is rated at a 60% duty cycle at that 220 amps of output, but I did not get to that. Now I don't know if the welder would have been able to do it or not, but I was having issues with the accessories long before that, so I stopped. And the way I had planned to do the test was 60% is 60% of 10 minutes. So I was going to do 2 minutes welding, stop for 1 minute to let things cool, weld for another 2 minutes, stop for another minute to let things cool, weld for another 2 minutes, and then stop for the last minute of the 10. So that would give me 6 total minutes of welding in that 10 minutes, but would give a little bit of cooling time in between rather than just 6 continuous minutes. Now I did the 2 minutes at 220 amps output, then I waited for a minute, then I started again, but after only about a minute, I started to have some issues with the accessories, so I stopped. So I only got about 3 minutes with a minute of pausing in between there out of this before I started having problems. I don't know if the welder itself is capable of it, but the included accessories definitely are not. But before we get into the issues with the accessories, let's just talk a little bit more about the welder itself. I do have that gas fitting kind of rigged in the back. It still leaks a tiny bit. If I shut the valve on the tank off, the pressure will drain out after a few minutes. So it does have a leak that I wouldn't necessarily consider acceptable. Going forward, I would definitely just change out that fitting in the back to make sure that I had no leaks. But it was working well enough to do the testing. But that is still definitely an issue. And I do have an email into Amico about that issue with the gas fitting, and we'll see what they say. And if their response is noteworthy, maybe I'll make a quick update video just to let you know how that went. But that leads to the first little bit of an issue with TIG welding with this machine. There's no pre-flow, which isn't a huge issue except for the fact that you get that little bit of a surge from the pressure in the lines when the solenoid first opens, and that gives you like a little bit of a blast at the weld. Not a huge issue, but I think it would start a little bit better, and that first few seconds of weld would be better if you had just a little bit of pre-flow. But this machine does not have any pre-flow. The arc starts the instant the solenoid opens. It also has a fixed post-flow of about 2.5 seconds. That's no matter what amperage you're running or for how long. So even after that 2 minutes at 220 amps, when I let go of this button, 2.5 seconds, the gas shuts off. Because of that really low post flow, anything over, it seems like about maybe 120 amps, maybe a little bit more than that. And the tungsten gets really oxidized when you stop welding, just because it's still hot once that shielding gas shuts off. So the tungsten likes to discolor and oxidize a little bit, which makes your next start not as crisp and makes it so that, the first little bit of your weld isn't quite as clean. It also means that the cooling to the torch shuts off faster, so all of your consumables are going to run hotter. They're not going to last as long, and it just really seems like this welder would be a lot better if it had 160 amp max output. A lot of the things on here would make a lot more sense. The performance of the included accessories, the post flow, would all kind of make a little bit more sense. And Amico does have a 160 amp version of this, and it's actually the same size and weight. So I don't know what's actually different about it. Maybe nothing, maybe just different IGBT chips that are rated for higher amperage. I don't know if there's any difference. But to me, it seems like this welder has a bit more output than really makes sense for the way it's set up. And just to show an example of what I'm talking about, this is the tungsten after welding, and you can see it's just black and just really oxidized. And just to compare, here's a clean tungsten next to it, and you can see just how charred and baked that other one is. And you can see the included collet really got overheated. Now, at 220 amps, that can happen anyways, but it's just going to happen a lot more easily with cheap collets, and also just with not enough post flow to keep these things cool. So again, this happened after 2 minutes, 1 minute pause, and then another minute at 220 amps. This collet is just completely ruined. So keep in mind, post flow is only 2.5 seconds, kind of an issue at higher amperage. Now at the end of that, the reason why I cut it short after only 3 minutes, so 30% duty cycle, and didn't try to get to the full 60% is because the ground cable or work clamp cable was actually getting quite warm, and the insulation on it was getting very soft, and it felt like it was about to start melting. The clamp itself was very hot to the touch, and I'll show you some other issues with the clamp itself in a second here, but this was very hot. Also, the torch itself was quite warm, not necessarily dangerously so. I mean, I've got torches hot enough that the rubber on the end here was actually smoking slightly with my other welder. Once they cooled off, they were still fine. So this one wasn't smoking, and it wasn't super burning hot yet. So I don't think the torch was necessarily an issue yet, but the cable was quite hot. Even through this sleeve, it was very, very warm. I mean, it wasn't burning me, but it was quite warm, and I didn't want to keep going on it. Now, the clamp itself being warm after that, it was not due to a connection issue at my table. I actually have braided straps connected to my table, large copper straps that I put just all in through here, the clamp, so they get really good connection. And my strap was not even warm, and the jaws where they were contacting that strap were not warm. So I think the connection there was good, but this part of the clamp up in here was very, very warm. So that much current going through this just was really heating this up. This stamped steel clamp up in here where this cable connects and all that, it's just really not rated for that amperage. Or if it's rated for it, it just doesn't handle it. So again, it works for the 220 amps, but certainly I would be very nervous trying to push it anywhere near 60% duty cycle at 220 amps. Now another issue with this clamp, it's kind of hard to tell, but these little side pieces of stamped metal actually stick down a hair further than the copper. Now that wouldn't be really that big a deal. You could bend those out and it would be okay. But now you can see this discoloration here, and this did not happen when I was running at 220 amps. This happened when I was running closer to 120 amps, and at one point I went to move the clamp and it was just burning hot. And where it was clamped to the work, it was only touching right on this very corner. And so this very corner was just burning hot, and you can see even the steel on the outside, you can see is just all discolored there. You have to really make sure this has got a really good connection to your work, because it does a tendency not to be. All four of these little kind of copper jaws are just round. Most of them will have one or two that are kind of a straight edge, and that straight edge is nice because you can kind of wiggle it around and get it to really bite into whatever your work is, to kind of, you know, scrape through any dirt or whatever that's there. These being round made it just feel like it kind of wanted to just skate on top of whatever was there, and you really had to work at it to ensure you had a really good ground, because otherwise, like I said, this would just really heat up. Another issue with the clamp is that it isn't straight. It kind of wants to go completely sideways when you squeeze it. You can see it just wants to go completely sideways. And if I try to make it go straight, I kind of can, but it just falls back crooked. At first glance, it looks decent. It's got copper jaws, copper strap, but and this is all tight up in here, and all these jaws are tight, but it just has some high resistance in here, and it really heats up when you put some amps through it. And it just kind of wants to go crooked when you compress it. Honestly, the main issue with the ground clamp, as far as reaching that 60% duty cycle at 220 amps, is the cable. The whole length of it was very, very warm after that 3 minutes at 220 amps. And it's kind of hard to see. I don't know if you can tell, but the insulation actually heated up so much it got really soft, and it's kind of loose on the conductors inside. So it almost feels like you can just kind of scooch the insulation around on the conductors inside. Not great. Just that little bit of time, just that 3 minutes at 220 amps, and the insulation on this cable is kind of permanently messed up just a little bit. This insulation cannot hold up to very high temps. I don't know how well it would hold up to any kind of welding spatter or slag that fell on it hot, and so just something to be aware of, that this insulation seems to be very cheap. Now on to one of the things I liked the least about this welder, and that was actually the Tig Torch. I did mention in the first part that it's very large, it's very bulky, but until I actually started using it, I didn't realize just how annoying it was going to be for me. Now, part of it is just because it's so different from what I'm used to using. Doesn't really work out for how I personally like to hold a Tig Torch, but it doesn't work for how I like to personally hold a Tig Torch. And I kind of had to change everything about how I was holding the torch as compared to what I normally do. And even at that, it's just so bulky. This cord is very stiff. It's very heavy. The torch cable is heavy and stiff. Now, heavy isn't necessarily a bad thing, because you want it to have a lot of copper in there. You want it to be able to handle the amps. But just that weight combined with the stiffness just makes it want to tweak in your hand so much while you're trying to do the fine, precise control that you want to be able to have with TIG. I mean, that's one of the big benefits of TIG, is that you can really get that precise control, that really fine work. And I just found that this torch was just a pain in fighting me the whole way. Part of the problem is the fact that the control button is so far from the end of the torch, and you have to have that button pressed to weld. So one of the ways, and I'm actually left-handed, but I'm just, for the video, I'm holding it with my right hand, and I do weld either way depending on the joint and stuff. So this is how I normally like to hold a Tig Torch. I'll press the button with my index finger. Now, I have a foot pedal for my other welder, but I do have a button that I'll put on the torch for if I'm in a tight spot and I don't want to use the foot pedal. But if I'm holding the torch like this, I'm really far from the end, and I can't get the angle that I want, just because of the shape of this handle and the shape of the head. So if I'm resting on the bench like this, it makes it almost impossible to get into any kind of position that I would like. Now, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll actually hold right up here, and then that'll give me even more control, and I can get into where I need to get, but then I can't press the button on this torch. I actually found what I ended up doing quite a lot was holding the torch all the way up here, and then using my palm to actually actuate the button. And that gave me a little bit better control. But just overall, very difficult to use, very awkward. And another reason that was a problem is that this button, you can probably hear that clicky detent. When that clicks, that's not far enough. You have to actually push it just a little bit further, and then it lights. And it takes quite a bit of pressure to do that. I mean, not massive pressure, but it's very easy when you start welding, and then you're kind of following the joint, and you get into kind of an awkward position, and then you realize all of a sudden the pressure on that button lifted up a little bit, or your finger moved on it a little bit, and all of a sudden your arc goes out, and then you have to get back on that button and push it hard, and the detent didn't release. I mean, if you release it far enough, it'll click because the button came all the way out, but the arc will go out long before it actually unclicks. Now keep in mind I may be a tiny bit biased because this is actually the torch that I normally use. And you can see this is just the difference in size here. I mean, this is just a tiny, tiny torch. I mean, you compare it to this, and it's just, I mean, it's just no comparison. And so with this torch, you know, I can get right up on that joint. I can really have the control and the precision that I need. And this is actually how I most often hold it. And I can just run along the joint just like this. It just works out great for me. The button that I have, I can strap right here so that I can push it with my index finger, and it just works out great for me. And so keep in mind, this is what I'm used to, so this is obviously going to feel way different, and I'm going to hate it just because this is what I'm used to. But even keeping all that in mind, I really think you could get a 26 style torch with a button on it in a much smaller package than this that would be much easier to use, much more convenient. You know, for somebody just starting out or something and they're trying to learn that control and, you know, keep everything steady and keep their arc length correct and all that, it's just awkward. I just really don't like it. And then, you know, again, just combine that with the valve you can't use and this overly stiff button that's kind of quirky, and just really not a fan. Now, as far as the high frequency arc starts themselves, initially I found it very unreliable. The tungsten had to be just almost touching the work. I mean, virtually no gap. I mean, you couldn't even see the gap. And it's, you know, when you'd light it up that close, the puddle would form fast enough that it would end up touching the arc or touching the electrode, and you'd get contamination, and it was just a problem. So I ended up opening the welder back up and adjusting that point gap in there a little bit, and it did get a tiny bit better, but it's still a little bit inconsistent. Sometimes you'll press the button, the gas will start, and you'll just sit there, you know, kind of trying to get the tungsten a little bit closer, a little bit further, wiggle it around, try and get it to start, and it just never does. So I found a lot of times if you just, without the button pressed, touch the tungsten to the work, lift it, then press the button, then the arc would start most of the time. Still not every time. Sometimes you'd still have to fiddle with it a little bit, but if you touch the tungsten to the work first, lift it, then press the button, that would usually start as long as you did have your gap pretty tight. But it just was a little bit fiddly. Not terrible, but really not that great. And I've used lift start machines before that really were hardly any more trouble than that. So, I mean, you know, the lift start machine, you touch the tungsten, lift it, it starts. And so, I mean, I just don't feel that the high frequency start really adds that much to this welder. It's nice, but it's not that big of a deal of a feature. I honestly think I would prefer if this machine was lift start, just because of the way this torch is. If this machine was lift start, I wouldn't have to worry about that button. I could just get a good comfortable hold on the torch, get my arc started, and then not have to worry about that button. It would also be easier to switch to a different torch since I don't like this one. For the vast majority of the work that most people are going to be doing with this torch, they would not need a 26 size. 26 style torch is rated to 200 amps, and like I said, it didn't get all that hot in my testing, so I think the torch probably is handling the 200 amps better than just about anything else in the system. But considering the fact that long before the torch overheated, the cable was overheating, the ground cable was overheating, the ground clamp was overheating, I think that the vast majority of the time you'd be totally fine with a smaller torch, and it would just be nice to be able to just plug any old torch in there, use lift start, not have to worry about this button, because this connector is kind of odd, so you're not probably going to get a button with that connector on it very easily, if at all. So just something to keep in mind if you are just dead set on getting one of this type of welder. I would probably just go ahead and get the cheaper one that doesn't have the high frequency start and just not bother with it. But I do have an idea for changing out the torch to a smaller one, just since I have the welder now. I might as well put a torch on it that I don't hate using. So I'm actually just going to use this wire. I'm just going to take this wire out of this torch and just wire it up to a button on the new torch. So it's not like you're absolutely stuck with this torch, and you know, maybe somebody will use it. They don't have that frame of reference for that small torch. This is all they know. They just get used to it. It's their norm, and they're fine with it. But for me, I would not be happy with this torch. So overall, I would say it does okay. Actual output performance is better than I expected. but I still probably would not recommend this welder. Chances are, even if the manufacturer is at all responsive during the warranty period for getting an issue resolved, if you ever did have an issue, it does state right in the manual that round-trip shipping is not covered. So if you had any issue with this welder, the step is to contact them, get approval to ship it to them. Then you would have to ship it to them on your expense. Then they will inspect the welder and make the decision as to whether or not it's something they're going to repair. And then either way, then they would ship it back to you again at your expense. So chances are, just based on the price of this welder, round-trip shipping would not be worth it. And while I can't comment on the long-term durability and reliability of this welder, I didn't have any major issues with it while I was using it. In terms of reliability and durability. Again, just after that look inside, all the capacitors are kind of generic Chinese capacitors. A lot of the components are. So it may hold up just fine, but I'd also probably is a little bit more likely to have issues than some other welders out there. But all I can say for sure is what I've had during my use, and during my use it has worked okay. You have extremely low quality accessories, all of which did technically work, so you wouldn't necessarily have to replace them. But chances are, if you were using them for any length of time, you probably would end up wanting to replace them eventually. So that's going to add cost on top of what you paid initially. There's also still that ongoing issue with the gas connection on the back of the welder. There's the weird quirks with the arc starting. There's the issue of the only 2.5 second post flow for the shielding gas. The fact that the stick stinger is kind of falling apart. The fact that the included TIG accessories are very low quality. No one thing is just absolute deal breaker, but taken overall as a package, there's just a lot of little things that it's like, oh, well, I can overlook that, I can overlook that, I can overlook that, I can overlook that. And eventually it gets to the point that you're overlooking a whole lot to justify the cost. And at least for me personally, I would prefer to just spend more and get something a little nicer. But my recommendation, if you are going to get a welder like this, you say, you know what, it did work, he did the testing, it has good output, it worked, it didn't blow up. It has a reasonably smooth TIG arc. It does run most stick electrodes fairly well. You know what, I'm getting one. If that's the case, I do at least have some recommendations for you. I would not spend extra to get one that had more than, say, 160 or 180 amps of output. I think it's pretty rare that you would really use that output in a welder like this, and the accessories that it comes with really aren't up to that task anyways, so I wouldn't bother spending the money for it. Also, just me personally, I wouldn't spend extra to get high frequency start. Lift start isn't that hard to do. You don't have to deal with a button or potential issues that button may have down the road, issues with finding the right connections if you wanted to swap anything out. You wouldn't have to deal with any of that. You just use the lift start and go. So if you were going to get something like this, I would recommend not spending for the extra output, not spending for the high frequency start. And when it comes right down to it, I don't think the internal gas solenoid even adds all that much. Since it has just a really weak post flow and no pre-flow, I would say you're just as well off to just get a torch with a valve on it, and you can get small torches with valves on them. So I would recommend just get a torch with a valve on it. That way you control the pre-flow, you control the post flow, and again, it's not that difficult to do. So an internal gas solenoid is definitely a nice convenience feature. So if you really wanted one, I don't think it's really that big of a deal. It does work fine on this machine. I just think that the post flow on it is pretty limiting. Even at 120 amps, I would probably prefer at least 4 seconds. So there's my results, how it worked for me, what I thought of it. Hopefully, again, this helps somebody kind of get an idea what they're getting with one of these welders and what they can expect to get out of it. If I do get some more use on it and anything relevant comes up, maybe I'll do a follow-up video just to let you know how it's going. If I hear from Amico about the issue with the gas fitting. Oh, and just a couple of quick notes. When I was doing the testing, it was about 40 degrees or so in the shop, Fahrenheit. The welder didn't thermal out or anything during those 3 minutes at 220 amp output. But again, 40 degrees in here. If it was an 80 or 90 degree day, or at least 80 or 90 degrees out here in the shop, which it will be in the summer, that may affect this. Also, again, these things getting that hot, this cable, this insulation getting all soft and weird, all that happens at about 40 degrees. So it would only be worse if it was 80 or 90 degrees in here. So just something to keep in mind. It was fairly cool in the shop when I did all the testing. Also, I didn't use the included tungsten at all during the testing. I used some 3/32 tungstens that I already had, and the reason for that is that the included tungsten was 1/16 inch, so pretty small tungsten, and that 1/16 tungsten isn't really rated for that kind of power, so I never actually used it. And if you sharpen a fine point on a 3/32 tungsten, it'll work fine right down to really low amps. So I didn't really see a need to go down to that 1/16 tungsten for any of the testing, so I actually never used it. And another note that you probably saw when we were doing the amperage testing, but I was able to get a good solid start and a steady, reliable arc at down to about 18 amps with this machine. So it will weld pretty low amperage. I mean, you're not going to get those 1 or 2 amp really low arc starts that you'll get with some of the real high-end machines. But I was pleased to see that it went down all the way to actually a little bit below 20 amps. So not too bad on the low end there. So I think that does it for part 2. If there's anything I missed or if you have any questions, post them up down below. Thank you for watching. Take care.